The 2004 elections to the European Parliament mark a turning point in the history of European integration. As several political analysts have agreed, they were probably the last Euro elections under the old treaties and the first in a wider, more heterogeneous, fragmented and disparate Europe. With more than 350 million people in 25 countries having the right to vote, the 2004 European parliamentary elections took place only a few weeks after the accession of 10 new member states to the European Union, the largest political and economic expansion ever. During these elections, a broad range of issues was raised, including the voter turnout, suffrage, and the incompatibilities of mandates. Typified by a rejection of particular EU policies and measures, the Eurosceptics expressed scepticism towards the European project since Britain's entry into the European Economic Community. Eventually, the debate over the European Union has been as strong inside the political parties, counting in their ranks people with contrasting views. By some means or other, the Central and Eastern European countries sought the EP elections of 2004 to rebuff to their new EU partners along two tracks. The minority of the electorate that bothered to vote ceased to back anti-EU parties with great passion, whilst showing a lack of significant concerns. Given that there was no main ground of voter apathy in the new member states, two recurring features of the post-election commentary covered with both disillusionment with national governments and suspicion of what EU membership might bring in subsequence. Austria, for instance, called for a halt to Turkey's European Union membership talks. The Socialists, Democrats and Greens group, on the other hand, vested their political and economic interests, which ran counter to the professed core values of the Union. These parties tempted to amplify their differences rather than trying to bring fairer contributions to Europe, and this might be related to the resistance to the liberalization of Austrian water resources, the fight against both the use of atomic energy and the financial privileges within the European Parliament. The crucial debate, therefore, was imbued with accusations standing primarily on the credibility and consistency of the contenders' plausible argumentations. The inward-looking and nationally oriented contest between the governing parties and the Social Democratic Party were accompanied by a public discourse and growing awareness of the need to focus on European issues, and at the same time to hold a definite European perspective. The 2004 European elections in Belgium were a typical example of second-order national contests. On the contrary, the campaign, the issues and the media coverage were dominated by first-order national affairs, resulting from the co-occurrence of the European Parliament in those regional elections. The outcomes strongly converged for Wallonia and Flanders to the extent that the winners could be held among the opposition parties only when the government parties lost their votes. The quest to render Cyprus's national problem turned out to be the focal point of most campaigns, as in what follows: the 24th of April referendum, with the profound consumption it entailed, the controversy of such an important matter in relation to the Euro election, which left no room for the Cypriots to immerse themselves in labyrinthine European issues. After showing a considerable support for European integration, a sense of discontent with the European Union had been set in motion because of any lack of assistance provided by the Commission and other EU organs, which called for a European or a fairer plan than that of Kofi Annan. Finally, voters seemed convinced that the priority was to concentrate on how the EU would address and solve Cyprus's own disputes. In the Czech Republic, the Socialist Party highlighted common principles with other socialist, Social Democratic and Labour parties, whose shared ideas became more visible during their participation in the European Convention. Nevertheless, the Democratic Union of Freedom, formed after the division of the Civic Democratic Party in 1998, presented itself as Euro-optimistic. It essentially sought to further expand the European Union, while making the European card part of the main convergence between the official document system of the United Nations and its efficiency. Likewise, the Christian Democratic Union Czechoslovak People's Party supported the European orientation of the country and conceived of the EU as an embodiment of its own Christian democratic values. The CDP has always proclaimed EU membership as a key objective in the Czech foreign policy. On the contrary, the ODS has debated over certain concepts, such as Europe of the regions or the social state. The campaign in Denmark was not only shorter than those before national elections, but also more enclosed and less intense. Voter ignorance about the candidates and insufficient female representation were in fact among the serious issues addressed throughout the political campaign. The EU financial support for the agricultural industry was put on the agenda when a national TV station broadcast made a list of Danish beneficiaries, thereby provoking all parties to call for a change in the EU system. Likewise, the prospect of Turkish EU membership was taken into consideration. Whereas the Danish People's Party opposed Turkey's accession, other parties considered it as something that would maintain the European security. In the same context, Estonian parties based their campaigns on matters concerned with the eligible party alliances in the European Parliament. On the local level, the Respublika asked for a cooperation between the 6 Estonian members of the EP in order to protect the Republic's interests within the EU. Whilst the Reform Party's campaign preordained lower taxes, the Centre Party stressed the free movement of workers alongside the high social welfare benefits in Europe. One of the most common arguments put forward for the enlargement of the EU was that the rule of law and respect for human rights would spread systematically eastwards and that EU membership would some way guarantee Western-style ideals of democracy. Opponents of EU membership in Estonia, however, believed that the real source of power would be the EU Commission, which was considered as overly centralized and bureaucratized, and that was of the same mind as to post-Soviet states. They argued that the legacy of Soviet-style bureaucratization attracted no significant attention. The parties in Finland, meanwhile, had diverted their focus away from the elections, since they had enough time, money and energy to be spent on the elections. Finland's national interest was perhaps the main issue by which the whole debate was focalized on familiar topics in Finnish EU policy defense, along with the decision on whether Finland should apply for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization membership, agriculture, regional policy, and for sure without dismissal of the welfare state. In such a line of thought, the EP elections in France were utterly overshadowed by domestic politics. Even though the president Jacques Chirac championed the EU, he was for the most part laconic, especially in the press conference of the 29th of April 2004, where the mainstream parties were distracted by power struggles. His words of encouragement for the French MEPs marked a departure from the campaign. Until then, the president endeavored to pursue a traditional way by belittling the significance of the European Parliament and ignoring the MEPs' potential to formulate an efficient French policy in the EU. Arguably, the 2004 European Parliament elections confirmed to the pattern established in the 5 previous polls that were held in Germany. The Social Democratic Party of Germany attempted to consider the subject matters, which in effect had been successful in the 2 previous Bundestag elections. In reality, its TV commercials plugged social justice, while the CDU campaign poster propagated Europe as a force for peace. Particularly noteworthy was that the present campaign constructed itself around the indistinct slogan of "Germany can do more in Europe." Once more, it was the party's TV commercials which were more blatant in their attempt to benefit from an anti-government vote by focusing exclusively on the SPD Green government's record. On the other side, the New Democracy in Greece declared its full support for the EU constitution and federal solutions to European integration, whose message, however, followed a domestic debate. The pan-Hellenic socialist movement, known by the acronym PASOK, was characterized by its complex campaign. The EP elections' widely circulating slogan, "We demand development and jobs for everyone. We pursue knowledge and jobs for the young. We vote for Greece and Europe," aimed beyond doubt to present Papadreou's priorities for the party policy. The Communist Party was the only one which sought to target Europe in particular, as well as the EU constitution and the European integration in general. It simply embraced the motto of resistance, disobedience, revolt against the EU. With its main concern developing on domestic issues, the coalition of the radical left, SIN, tried to persuade the public by claiming that there is another way, take it to the left. The success of the new far-right party was, to everyone's surprise, of paramount significance. The Laos, which adopted a religious orthodox support and xenophobic rhetoric, followed a campaign whose leader, George Karatzaferis, believed in the "vote yes for him who knows how to say no." Consistent with this trend, the Hungarian party's distinct attitudes towards the European integration might have set the stage for a campaign coping the policies through which the newly elected MEPs could influence. However, the salience of EU policy issues remained ground level during the campaign period. The campaign in Ireland was marked by a complete absence of issues pertaining to the EU. The high degree of consensus across the electorate distinguished Ireland from other EU countries, where the principle of membership is still politically divisive. Nevertheless, the Irish party manifestos suggested more polarisation than what actually emerged on the campaign trail. The so-called Lisbon strategy, for instance, evoked a variety of positions. While the Greens and the Labour Party drew attention to the environmental and social objectives of the aforementioned strategy, though it acknowledged some concern for the less well-off. The Conservative and Christian Democratic political party attempted to bridge the gap between the haves and have-nots. We cannot isolate the need for social inclusion from any growth agenda, nor can we ignore the environment in which people live. The political campaign in Italy was run by national parties in cooperation with EP transnational political groups. The Socialists, FI and Verdi, in the same manner, contributed to draft the common manifesto of the Party of the European Socialists, the European People's Party and the Greens. Forza Italia inserted Partito Popolare European, while the Italian Communists added Sinistra European in their respective lists. Overall, the campaign was scarcely associated with EU issues. The EP elections in Latvia granted two main parties the chance to win political recognition. The first was Latvia's Way, that used the EP elections as a way of re-emerging in Latvian politics, and the second was the relatively recent and unknown Conservative Party. Its essential policy platform was to employ its influence in the European Parliament in order to adjust the Lat-Euro exchange rate and to bring about lower petrol prices. There was also a myriad of social democratic parties that participated in the elections, like the United Social Democratic Welfare Party, the Social Democratic Union, the regional Latgale Light, as well as the unknown Eurosceptics. Campaigns in Lithuania focused alternatively on domestic and local issues, such as agricultural subsidies, taxes, education, health, and pace of economic reforms. The new Labour Party, for example, campaigned on the basis that it would defend Lithuania's interests in the EU. In spite of some public meetings, the EP campaign in Luxembourg was almost invisible, since the campaign teams were very small. Except for the Green Party, there were no official distinction between the EP and the national campaign. EU transport policy was also figured, because apart from the Democratic Party, all parties opposed the EU's privatization of rail, hoping that Luxembourg would be among their list of priorities. In Malta, campaigning began only 6 weeks before the 12th of June. As the emphasis was on the mass media and billboards, the two main parties had an advantage, yet with little exposure of non-party candidates on their political stations. An interesting blend of domestic concerns and European factors appeared to dominate the electoral campaigns. As might be expected, most candidates were preoccupied with promoting their credentials as effective MEPs. To be specific, wider European issues, such as the new constitution or adoption of the euro, were complete non-starters. As in most EU states, national rather than European issues dominated the campaign in the Netherlands. In contrast to countries like France and Germany, a set of highly sensitive issues like the scope of the future constitutional treaty or the possible accession of Turkey were seldom raised in discussion. The European dimension was often limited to the question of whether Brussels should interfere in these policy domains and subsidiarity. The campaign in Poland was somewhat extremely low-key, and so it failed to capture the public's imagination. Yet only 3 of the 8 main groupings' slogans mentioned Europe, including the SLDUP, Law and Justice, and Polish Social Democracy. Attempts to introduce European elements were to be confined to persuading voters as to who would best represent Poland's interests. At the end of April, the campaign began in Portugal. European issues were far more prominent than that in the 1999 elections. The political groupings tended to stress the growing convergence of European and national policies. The most European of all candidates was Antonio Sousa Franco from the Socialist Party, which itself endorsed the European policies. The party's slogan was, in short, "With Europe in all big events." Not only it emphasized the importance of the EU policies for the future development of the country, but also it highlighted the need to defend national interests. In Slovakia, the election campaign concentrated mainly on the personalities of the candidates. The lack of topics and their abstract content reflected the absence of discussion about their European politics inside the political parties. Surprisingly, no political party or movement rejected the membership of Slovakia in the EU, yet a more sceptical approach was quite noticeable in the marginal Civic Conservative Party. The left-wing parties, on the other hand, concentrated on the social dimensions of European integration. The nationalistic formation, the Coalition of Slovak National Party, the Right Slovak National Party, as well as the LSHZ-DS8 of Mesier, were among the few parties who openly expressed their anti-Hungarian grievances. In Slovenia, the campaigns used mass media, especially TV, and sustained a direct contact with partisans and voters. Directly or indirectly, candidates stressed the need to include Slovene national interests in the EU. As yet, several well-rehearsed arguments from the EU accession campaign resurfaced. Consequently, voters did not pay attention to the campaign, where the public quickly realized that 7 Slovene MEPs would not have much say in the 732-member EP or in its political groups. The issue of who would be elected to the EP seemed irrelevant. The campaign in Spain was highly personalized, as it largely focused on domestic issues. The PP emphasized the successes achieved in their 8 years in government, seeking to shake away their March electoral defeat and the negative image left by their handling of the Madrid terrorist attacks. They presented the now ruling party Socialist Obrera Español as corrupt, looking for contradictions in the socialist policies. To their left, IU presented themselves as the true defenders of social Europe. The 3 coalitions of smaller parties tried to shift the debate towards the rights of regions and nations, with demands that went from the recognition of Catalan and Euskera as official EU languages, an EU intervention in the Gibraltar dispute, and a special statute for peripheral regions such as the Canary Island, to the self-determination of the Basque country. In Sweden, the organization of the party's election campaigns is a distinctly national affair, despite the obvious European dimensions. Awareness of the Eurosceptic climate of public opinion and increasing hesitancy towards European integration led campaign managers of almost entire parties to opt for the scheme of limiting EU power to fewer policy areas, but with stronger policy-making powers in areas where the public wanted more EU cooperation, such as crime generally and trafficking in particular. In this sense, some of the party's campaigns were populist in supporting and reinforcing the preferences of ordinary people. European issues in the UK, principally the Constitution and the question of Britain's continued membership of the EU, had a much higher profile. Yet, more often than not, the word euro appeared with reference to football rather than the single currency. The government's decision to go to war in Iraq featured, as did the economy and public services. However, opposition parties exploited the practical problems resulting from the government's decision to use postal voting for parts of Britain. Overall, the discussion of national issues was stimulated by the simultaneous local council and London mayoral elections.
It's a very pleasant duty on behalf of the Parliament to open this plenary session, which comprises the 626 members elected for the 5th mandate of the Parliament and the 162 new members from the 10 new states who acceded to the European Union on Saturday last, the 1st of May. I want from this platform to issue on our behalf, the 626, to the 162, a heartfelt, warm welcome. Welcome to this Parliament.